but I'm going to talk today about what really my passion at Stanford is, and one of the big reasons I'm here, which is to be part of the Biodesign program. We have a mission of developing the next leaders in medtech innovation, and instead of talking about a specific project, which I might get to, I'm really going to talk a little bit more about the process, because I think that's quite interesting and unique. I'm getting a little reverb. Can you guys hear me? Does the mic sound okay?
Yep.
All right. So we'll start interactive. What's the difference between these two things? There's sort of four basic questions that drive our process for developing medtech. That you can get from just looking at this. So first question, who buys this? Everybody in the room, right? So the consumer. Who uses it? Consumer. Who benefits from it? Consumer. Who regulates it? Government, but pretty light-handed regulation, right? So now think about those questions for this device. This is the Da Vinci robot, which is kind of the talk of the town in medicine at the moment. We won't go into details on it, but it's, pretty cool system. It offers some advantages in surgery. So who buys this? Hospital actually buys the capital equipment, but insurers pay for the disposable parts of it, so there's two people buying it. Who benefits from it? Probably the patient. Who uses it? Physician. All right, we've already got four very powerful groups involved, right? And then who regulates it? The FDA. So you can see that as we think about kind of the classic design thinking process, and unless you moved here yesterday or been in a coma, you probably read this, right? This is everywhere. The whole kind of empathize, define, ideate, prototype, test. It's great. It's a wonderful roadmap. But it's really mostly been thought about in terms of consumer products like the iPhone. And it really focuses on the person who's going to use it, buy it, and benefit from it. And so in order to design medical technology, we had the hypothesis starting 15 years ago in our program that you really need to build in early to the design process an understanding of those larger complexities when you're talking about medical technology. So we have sort of adapted it to what we think is important in medicine, which is instead of, empathize, but empathize by immersing yourself in the clinical realm. So go to the hospital, go to the patient's home, go to the clinics, see where medical problems occur. Need characterization, which is defining, coming up with solutions, prototyping and testing, and then getting into the three-headed monster of medicine where you have to understand who you're selling it to, who's paying for it, and who's going to benefit from it. Because really any one of those things can really derail a technology. It may be a great application, it may benefit patients, but if doctors aren't on board or payers aren't going to kind of be on board, you really have to understand that early on in the design process, we think, in order to set yourself up for success and ultimately get a good technology to patients. So we go through this process on a regular basis with our fellows. How do we do it? Well, one way is physical space. So this is a view of the campus. We're right here in this building. The Biodesign program is over here in the Clark Center. Clark Center is right in between medical campus and engineering. We like to think that random motion's great, but if you can get a lot of particles in a small space bumping into each other, you might have a better chance of things working. Sorry about that. I'm going to go back. So the Pete's Coffee in this building is thought to be where more medical devices have been invented than anywhere else in the world. May or may not be true. We also have close by the design school, which feeds into a lot of what we do, and the business school, which is important to taking things to the market. So physical proximity we think is important. What's the core of what we do? We run a 10-month fellowship that's process-driven. I'm going to talk about that process. We put multidisciplinary teams together, and each team has typically a physician, an engineer, and someone with industry experience. They speak very different languages. They don't always get along, but we put them in an environment where they're set up to come up with the newest technologies in medicine. We started with a U.S. fellowship of 4 people. We're now up to 12 U.S. fellows. We've also expanded to India and Singapore, because we think that there's different needs in those areas, and that you have to put people in that environment with training from here. What's the aim? We are fundamentally an education program. I'll talk about some of the results, which have sometimes been companies, sometimes been research projects, sometimes been philanthropic programs. But our goal is to train people, and to train people in a process that gives them a chance at getting good technologies to patients. We teach clinical need-based approach like we talked about, and we do teach some fundamentals of business and commercialization, which most people in both engineering and medicine don't have the fundamentals of understanding what markets demand and what it takes to get something to those markets. Where's the program gone? We started out in 2001, as I talked about, with 4 fellows. We've expanded to an India program. We've published textbooks. We've gone to Singapore. We've now got a faculty training program. We're in talks with Japan and Oxford, and we're kind of growing. There's about 30 programs that have kind of followed what we do, specifically in medtech. And we're proud of that, and most of them use the textbook that we developed to think about this. Our ultimate result is people who go into medical technology and hopefully make the world a better place and provide good solutions to patients and to healthcare systems. And it's a growing number now that we're doing 12 fellows a year. This is just the US graduates from the last 10 years. This is what one of our typical teams looks like. We have a physician, orthopedic surgeon, cardiologist, business experience, engineer with product design background. They're all at a level that we talk about where they have just enough training and knowledge to be dangerous, but not to be locked into a way of thinking. And it's kind of an important timing to get people at the right level. What's even more interesting is you'd think orthopedic surgeon and cardiologist would work on those projects. Absolutely not. We put these guys on OBGYN to solve problems. And why do we do that? Because we think it's really important that they bring a broad skill set, but that they look in new areas. And they ultimately go through what I'm going to talk about now, which is our process of going from being a physician in your silo as a physician, an engineer in your silo there, or working in industry, and how do you come together as a design team and come up with something. So we start the design teams with a boot camp, and that's really to get people talking the same language. Okay, they've got to kind of understand a little bit about what each other group does. We run them through the basics of what it means to identify a clinical problem, to really think about all the things we brought up with that first basic example of who's going to regulate it, who's going to buy it, etc. Once they've gone through that primer, we send them off to clinical immersion. There's the hospital. We'll give you a badge. Go find problems. We can, as a group, if we walked over there now, we could probably identify 100 problems in 5 minutes. It's not hard. I mean, it is the easiest thing in the world to find problems. Selecting the right one is kind of the secret sauce, but the clinical immersion is about observing. It's about listening to where physicians, patients, healthcare providers struggle. Of course, as Henry Ford said, if I listened to my customers, I'd give them a faster horse. So we also have them observe and pick up latent needs where maybe the physicians think it's going great, but it's obvious to an engineer that this could be done better. So they put all that together, and then what they have to do is really go through the hardest part of design, which is before you come up with a solution, really figure out what your problem is. And this is kind of a framework that we put to it, which is what we call a need statement. We have them really define the problem, really define the population, and really define the outcome that they want to solve. Seems easy, right? And you could put 3 words to that quickly. But when you go through this and you really start to dive into what each of these things is, population, for example, we were talking about a project today in trying to decrease re-excision rates for lumpectomies, so breast cancer. Great progress in that area that we're able to do breast-saving surgery. However, re-excision rates are somewhere in the range of 20%. We're talking today with a group that wants to decrease that. Now, is your population all women with breast cancer, or really should you focus on the group that you can have an effect on, which is typically stage 1, stage 2, smaller tumors, etc. So understanding exactly the population is really important. Understanding how you're going to measure the effect is important, because the only way you're going to show value to the system, to physicians, etc., is by measuring something. So we go through this process. This is a list of needs from one day. We have the fellows go through and be very, literally spend 3 months categorizing, defining, and validating. They have to talk to not only people in the ivory tower next door, they've got to go out to the community, they've got to see what happens with physicians and patients at private hospitals, at the VA system, at public hospitals. You can't just extrapolate what happens at Stanford to the rest of the world. So that's the validation and selection. During that process, they go from about 200 needs, where they go through a basic screening process. They use some high-level data to get down to the next level of needs. They then go really into diligence and looking at market, treatment, patient impact, how you're going to get there, who's going to pay for it, and the intellectual property landscape to get down to maybe 20 projects. Ultimately, they dive into those, to backtrack for 1 sec. Why go through all this? Because we think that making problems compete against each other allows you to pick a really good one. Does that make sense? And that's not always how we do it in academia, right? We often kind of pick the one project we're good at, we get grant funding on it, and therefore we're better at it, and then we just keep going on the same kind of train. And by every year picking a fresh group of problems, making them compete, and figuring out the one that's worth working on, we think we can get there, or get to really valuable projects. Once they get down to about the range of 20 projects, we allow them to begin solving. Okay, so we're 5 months in now to a fellowship where you're supposed to be an innovator, and we haven't come up with one solution. Does that strike anyone as a little difficult? It is, and truthfully, they've all come up with solutions in their head, but we just haven't let them articulate them. So once they've got the needs and they've really defined what it would take to solve the problem and have an impact on patients and be acceptable to the system, then they go into brainstorming and prototyping. This is the most fun part, the most creative part of the process. Once they've done that, then all of their brainstorm concepts have to compete against each other. Again, a little bit of competition we think is a good thing. And finally, they ultimately get down to really going deep into feasibility. And once you've got both your need and your concept, you can decide if they meet, if everything you said you needed to solve is being solved by what you do, and if the entire environment and medicine will allow you to do that. Is it technically feasible? Is there intellectual property space? Is there a business model to get this to patients? As Dr. Fogarty, who's the inventor of about 200 devices, says, you may have a good idea, but if you can't put a 1-800 number on it and service it, it's not going to work. Certainly not within the healthcare system we work in now. Can you get it through the regulators at a reasonable cost? And can you get it paid for? We then stop them just as they've gotten to a good idea. And we send them out on externships, sort of a unique aspect of our program where we say, okay, go out, see what it's like in the real world, go do an externship, work for a startup, work for a design firm, work for a venture capital group, learn a little bit about what happens in the real world. It's an important thing for our fellows that I just mentioned, although it's not really part of the process. And then we bring them back, and once they come back, the last couple of months of the fellowship is about what we call implementation, which is trying to really figure out, okay, we've gotten to a really good concept, we think we're firm on something that can help patients. How do we ultimately get it to those patients? And that's typically through commercialization pathway. It doesn't always have to be. There is philanthropic routes and grant funding that can get you there for small markets, pediatrics, global, etc. But typically most medical devices in the US have to go through some sort of commercialization pathway. So that's implementation. Have we had any success whatsoever? We think so. In terms of our fellows, they've done a wide range of things, but almost 100% of them have gone into careers in medical technology. So again, as our product is people who understand med tech and trying to make that ecosystem better, we feel like we've been pretty successful. We've been doing it for about 14 years. There have been 37 startups, meaning companies that have been externally funded for $1 million or more. Lots of patients treated. Now this number is actually up to about 400,000 at the moment, with about 15 separate devices that have received regulatory approval in both Europe and the US. Created a number of jobs, raised a lot of money, and started a lot of other programs worldwide that are doing similar things, but catering to their specific medical technology needs in their markets. So I've been proud of that. That's kind of the overview of the process. Given a few minutes left, I was going to walk you through one device as a specific example. Here's a number of the companies that have come out. This is one that I've worked on for a little while called Insight. So back to the design process, we found a need around epidural technologies, epidural anesthesia. Currently, if anyone's had an epidural, doctors come in and blindly put a needle right next to your spine. That may have worried you, maybe it didn't. Usually they're pretty good at it, but there are some issues that can occur. The needle comes through a very dense piece of material called the ligamentum flavum. This is part of the understanding process. It gets into the epidural space. If it goes too far, it can cause problems. It takes a lot of force because that ligament is more like wood when you think about the mechanics of it than it is like soft tissue. And the problems that can occur are you can rupture the dura and get a leak of spinal fluid. You can have puncture of the vein. You can have malposition of the catheter and not get very good pain control. Understanding the percentages and whether you can have an effect on these are important, and I won't go into all those details, but we thought this was a great opportunity to do something better than blindly putting a needle in there. A lot of brainstorming around ideas and concepts, teeth and jaws, and a lot of things that everyone in this room could think of, given the problem very well defined. Everybody here could think of probably a better way to do it. It was really the secret is in defining the problem very well. We refined it and got down to ultimately a product. Within a couple of days, we could prototype. Our idea was just use a screw, right? So that ligament acts like wood. If that's how it acts, use something that works well on wood. You wouldn't put a needle into the wall to hang a painting, right? You'd use a screw because it's controlled. So we tested it in tissue and it worked pretty well. Ultimately, the idea was you got to use something sharp to get it there. But once you get to this dense tissue, before you get to the spot where you need to be, you can use a threaded device, a screw, and then sort of enter the space and deliver the medication just like you would for an epidural done with a needle. We went through a lot of prototyping, testing each individual question about this. How big are the threads? How long should they be? How wide? Etc. Can we get a catheter through a reasonable sized device? You know, each prototype has to answer a specific question in the design process, and you can see that sometimes they can be big, sometimes they have to be at scale. Mechanical testing, you know, I don't claim to be a hardcore scientist, but when you need to use scientific measures, they're certainly important. These are insertion forces, pull-out forces, push-pull testing, video that's not going to show. But this is basically showing a simple animal test that we were able to do, piggybacking on other animal work. And then with all that in place, we were able to do a first initial clinical trial, and ultimately, based on that, get approval in Europe. And so far, I've treated a couple hundred patients, and have a lot of hope that both this, in combination with new insights that we learned from being in this market, which has led to a second-generation device to help guide the needle, in addition to being safe as it enters, that this might lead to ultimately a technology that helps patients. So I think in conclusion, we talked a little bit about the process. So our flagship here is the fellowship that I talked you through. It's essentially a one-year program. We've recently been able to go global that we talked about. We've also expanded within the university to an undergraduate class, which I teach in this room, which is ironic. And we've expanded to graduate level classes. We've expanded to a faculty program so that faculty members who are working in all different areas, rejuvenation, can learn about what it takes to do medical device design. And we're really excited about all that. And then I was able to show you one example of going through the design process. Pretty simple solution, but it took characterizing the need very well and understanding the ecosystem of medicine to come to a pretty simple solution. I thank you very much for the opportunity to talk.